Call this meeting of the Transit Service Delivery Advisory Committee to order. My name is John McGlennon. I am a member of the James City County Board of Supervisors, and I am chair of the TSDAC. And I'm going to ask each member to introduce themselves, as we have one of our first in-person meetings in a while, and are joined for the first time by our new director as well, Director Robinson. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And I'll turn it over to our Vice Chair, Cindy Mester.
Thanks, John. Cindy Mester with the City of Falls Church, and I serve representing VML.
Tiffany Robinson, Director of DRPT.
Noel Pinker, Hampshire Transit, and I represent BTA.
Jamie Jackson, Fredericksburg Go, and I represent DRPT.
Kate Mattice. I'm the Executive Director of the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, and I'm here on behalf of Virginia Transit Association.
Brian Booth, I'm the Director of Blacksburg Transit, and I'm representing CTAB.
Okay. And we have staff members here as well, just so that folks who are viewing can know who's in the room.
Good.
Okay, I'm Dan Sonnenklar. I am a statewide planning manager, and I oversee the operating and capital programs.
Dale Parker, good morning, everyone. Communications specialist here at DRPT.
I'm Zach Trogdon, Chief of Public Transportation at DRPT.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. How are you?
Okay. I guess while Dr. Smith is sitting, I'm Tiffany Dubinsky. I'm our Director of Transit Planning at DRPT.
Grant Sparks, Director of Statewide Transit Programs, DRPT.
Deanna Owari, Chief Financial Officer, DRPT.
Evan Price, Data Policy Specialist, DRPT.
Dr. Smoot, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself and
I'm Ray Smoot from Montgomery County, Transportation Board member, and I left home this morning at 6 a.m. pouring down rain. And all was well until I got to Zion Crossroads in 64. They closed it. Apparently there was a fairly large crash or something. So I had the opportunity to come to Richmond, as we all did 50 years ago on 250. Don't do that.
there is an advantage to having that experience, though. Allowed you to find that all.
Like a lot of memories.
All right, thank you all very much. This is, of course, our first public first meeting in person in a while, and I was glad to have the whole TSDAC here. Jim Dyke is on his way, as I understand it. He'll fill out the roster. We will start with the approval of the April 1st, 2025 minutes. Does anyone have any corrections or amendments to those minutes? Not to have a motion to approve.
So moved.
Second.
Seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. Motion is approved. And our first presentation is on the fiscal year 26 merit operating assistance, and that's recommended allotment and staff to be handling that.
Sure, I'll take that.
Thanks, Dan.
So yeah, I'll be operating assistance and capital assistance, recommended projects and allocations for the fiscal year 26. Again, my name is Dan Sonnenklar. You all have seen me here doing the same presentation for the past few years, so happy to be here once again. And I will get my own slides. Excellent. Okay, so great. So starting with operating assistance, this first slide just kind of gives a rundown of our overall revenues this year and what data we use to calculate our operating allocations in FY26. So the total operating assistance allocated, revenues available in our FY26 SIP was 127.2 million. That is slightly less than last year. We had 128.6 in FY25. This consisted of two different sources of money that I broke down here. We had 121.8 new money from the CMTF. That comes from the 24.5% allocation from that pool. We also have $5.4 million in carryover money. And I just wanted to point that out because what happens every year is we get the actual allocations to our agency from the state in late May, early June. And so that's too late to incorporate into the SIP. So they often come in higher than anticipated even just a few months before. So we had some extra padding in the program this year because the formula that we ran this year is based on the metrics outlined here. So for sizing metrics, again, that is operating cost, ridership, hours, and miles. We used FY24 data. And for the performance metrics, we used the 3-year, year-over-year trends of FY21, 22, 23, and 24. And that was for passengers per hour, passengers per mile, cost per hour, cost per mile, and cost per passenger. Notably here, this is the first year that we do not have pre-pandemic data in the formula. If you all recall, for the past few years, we still had FY19 data in there because there was a pause placed on some of our financial reviews during the worst of the pandemic of FY20. And so we are finally beyond all of that. And all of this is either pandemic era data or beyond. So it reflects our kind of growth in ridership, hours, miles, et cetera, since the pandemic hit.
Close of the pandemic.
Exactly. And just a reminder here that the CTB policy currently caps the amount of operating assistance to any one agency to 30% of its operating expenses based on its most recently audited financial reports. So in that case, it is FY24, which set the high level for every. I already moved ahead. All right, so this slide is a little bit of an overhaul to what you all have seen here before. Tried to be a little clearer here and include a little bit more information. This and the next slide highlights the FY26 operating systems allocations compared to FY25. It also includes in the orange kind of hash marks above each of these lines what the 30% cap would have been for each of those agencies. And so the blue bars are the FY26 allocation and the gray bars are the FY25. In addition, there are small arrows down by the names, which indicate whether an agency saw an increase in FY26 compared to 25 or a decrease. So the green arrows upwards are an increase and the red arrows downward are a decrease. So what we see here is the 4 largest agencies are the 4 largest agencies that we've seen in the past. That is HRT, Fairfax County, GRTC, and DASH in Alexandria. Notably, Fairfax County and HRT switched places for the number 1 or the highest allocation in FY26. 9 of the 19 agencies on this chart here saw a decrease between last year and this year. And the other 10 are experiencing a slight or large increase compared to last year. And usually what we do here is I go through this in the next 2 slides, and then we'll pause for questions and kind of go back and forth. But yeah, we'll get into the other agencies and then how everything compares statewide. So I will push it along. Again, here, this is the same, but for the lower 2 quartiles. So these are the smaller agencies. Notably here, sorry, I'm going to flip back to the first one. The y-axis here goes up to $30 million. The y-axis here goes up to $1 million. So it's significantly smaller levels of allocations. Blue bars, again, are FY26. Gray bars are FY25. And here, what's notable is that 16 of the 19 agencies are seeing a decrease compared to last year, and only 3 are going to see an increase compared to FY25. Yeah, so this is happening across the board. So 25 out of the 38 agencies in FY26 are experiencing a decrease compared to last year. And the reason for this is that, you know, the amount of money that we had in the program is slightly lower than last year. It's $1.4 million less. But what happens, as we went over, I think in October or maybe May of last year, is that some of those higher performing agencies in the formula capture more money as costs increase across the board. And so it can have an effect like this where a small decrease in money leads to, or a small decrease in overall revenues leads to a substantial decrease for a number of agencies across the state. And the last slide here. So this is the scatter plot that attempts to illustrate the change in operating assistance from FY25 and 26 for all 38 agencies at the same time. Here on the x-axis, we include the dollar values, and on the y-axis, it's the percentage value change. And so really everything concentrates on two sectors of this scatter plot, either the top right, which is the positive change, or the bottom left, which is the negative change. So starting with the upper right quadrant of this is all of the agencies that are experiencing an increase. The largest dollar amount increases in FY26 were Loudoun County out front, Dash, CAC, EIPC. And the largest percentage increases were the Pony Express of Chincoteague. Now, notably, they experienced a 79% increase, but that equaled something like $10,000. It's a very small agency. And the other ones were Loudoun, CAT, and Lake Area Transit, or Lake Area Bus, which experienced a jump this year. On the opposite side of the chart, the lower left, we illustrate the agencies experiencing, like I said, a decrease. The largest dollar amount decrease in FY26 was Fairfax County at a decrease of $2.8 million. GRTC, which is experiencing a decrease of a little over $1 million. Jaunt, which is around $950,000, and Petersburg at about $250K. The largest percentage decreases are Jaunt, Petersburg, Town of Alta Vista, and Blackstone area. Now, I will mention here, we can get into any questions that you all have about specific agencies on any of these, but the Jaunt-CAT relationship on here, I just wanted to highlight here. We at DRPT have been working to kind of get their finances more aligned with the services associated with the urban versus the rural area. So this decrease for Jaunt and increase for CAT was expected this year. And they're about 1-to-1. Actually, the total number of dollars from the state operating region increased slightly more than they've increased for CAT slightly more than they decreased for Jaunt. And that is more of an administrative change that we've made here at DRPT. But I'll pause there. I know this is a lot of data, and I'm happy to get into whatever you all to discuss.
Well, Dan, this is great to see the evolution of your charts and data. It is really useful to get more information graphically this way. So thanks very much for doing that. Anybody have questions, Kate?
I do, Mr. Chair. And so I thank you so much. I always love the way you guys show this. And I know, and we're going to get into metrics a little bit later, when you look at the stories, especially, and again, it's, obviously I've got NVTC related ones, both the winners with the Loudoun County, and then also those have been challenged with Fairfax Connector. Can you speak at all to what were the major drivers? Because I know there's operating costs, there's ridership, there's a couple of other things. For the ones who really made the difference between, Fairfax Connector, GRTC, Loudoun County, and Dash, I guess because you already spoke to Kat, do you want to talk a little bit about what were some of the factors that changed for them?
Sure, I'm happy to. The short story is that they're all different. Every agency's experience from year to year is different based on the data that's provided to DRPT and kind of used in the formula to distribute this. So I guess starting with the biggest decrease of Fairfax County, in analyzing the numbers behind it, it appears that the reduction is due to a mix of less overall revenue in the program, because they received less in redistributed money after that 30% cap was applied, but also a reduction in overall sizing metrics compared to the rest of the state. So for them, operating costs and ridership, both, they actually increased from 25 to 26, while their revenue hours and miles decreased. But all of the sizing metrics as a portion of the statewide sizing metrics went down. And so that caused that reduction in 2.8 million for Fairfax. For Loudoun, on the other side of it, the biggest winner, theirs is a totally different story here. Although it is driven almost entirely by their sizing metrics and not as much their performance metrics as well. Now, some of the reasons for this I'll get into in a moment as well, but their costs went up by 30%, ridership as well. Hours went up by 50% and miles as well. So those were huge jumps in the sizing metrics because this was the first year that the new Silver Line routes were reflected in their performance metrics. And so 21 new routes were launched in May of 2023. And so although that was in the last fiscal year, the real impacts of that were reflected in FY24, which is the baseline data for this. Additionally, the Keolis contract went through some big overhauls over the last 2 years or so that are now reflected in the operating cost data here. And that was some of the things we've spoken about in this group. There was a new labor agreement with the Keolis drivers and other staff. So those are the two biggest changes on both sides. Were there other ones, I'm sorry, that you had mentioned that you wanted me to?
No, that's actually helpful, but I think just getting at the point that this is about compared to others and change year over year, and now we're post-pandemic year over year. So this is really about sort of the trajectory that they've been going compared to the last 3 years.
Exactly. And there's a couple of really interesting ones in here. So GRTC, for example, they're experiencing a $1.1 million reduction compared to last year, which is significant. And that's almost completely due to the performance trends for them. Their sizing metrics have stayed very, very stable over the years. But their performance metrics are in some ways are going in a bit of a different direction to statewide performance metrics, because the thing about those performance trends is we're comparing them always to the statewide trend. And so even if GRTC's metrics stay flat, if the state is improving, that can hurt GRTC's ultimate. But each one of these has a story to unpack. And if others are interested in a specific agency, I might have notes on them here. I might need to look it up on my computer, but I can provide it.
Can I jump in and add two more?
Please.
Sure.
Petersburg, which was a loser in the formula this year, when we looked at their data, their ridership hours and miles have mostly been flat. They even saw mostly flat data throughout the pandemic too. They got less from what we could tell this year because their costs went down despite service levels and ridership remaining flat. Costs went down, I believe, because they had a pretty severe driver shortage, and then they had some key administrative staff that they had some vacancies for. So they just didn't spend much, but they kept service levels and ridership pretty flat. But the way that the sizing metric works, it's very focused on cost. So that's where they got hit. And then on the Pony Express, which is maybe the most peculiar outlier here, they saw the biggest jump. Very, very small agency. And I know Dan pointed out that in terms of dollars, it's not a whole lot of dollars. But when you get into these like micro agencies, a service change has giant impacts on cost. Pony Express, I think they added 2 or 3 additional days of service. They expanded their hours. They also were a one-person show. They had 1 full-time staff member, and they doubled it to 2. So again, that gets back to cost. And for these really small agencies, that does have an impact in the formula. So just wanted to point out those 2 as well.
You all might recall Pony Express of Chincoteague is often on has one of the biggest jumps or decreases because they're very susceptible to swings in this formula. That jump is $10,000 again, scaling there. So it's hard to see the scaling here. That's what the other 2 graphs are for. Here it's just, you get a little bit of the scaling for on the X axis, but the ones that are further out on the Y axis, they're usually not huge amounts of money if they're hugging that line. Any other questions on these 3 graphs or the overall distribution of operating funds in FY26?
Sure. I, as you know, appreciate the scatter chart. And you're right, you don't get the scale, but for me, that visualization on who's on the outliers so that you can understand the story is very helpful. So I appreciate that. And I think as we think about the impacts, I don't want to put a judgment call to it. There's impacts, positive, negatives. That doesn't mean in terms of percentages and dollars, it doesn't mean it's positive or negative. So I think we need to think about our ultimate goal and outcomes as we think what this data is telling us as we move forward.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Any other questions or comments?
Okay.
Capital?
We can move on to the capital program for FY26. And again, here we will be reviewing the FY26 recommended awards. Recommended because the SIP is currently, or the 6-year improvement plan program is currently in draft. So this year, this chart attempts to illustrate the overall program, kind of the scaling of the requests for funding versus what was selected for award in FY26 through our 3 separate program areas: state of good repair, minor enhancements, and expansions. So just as a reminder here, the state of good repair projects are those that replace assets that are at or nearing their useful life or their mileage, if they are vehicles. Minor enhancement projects are those that include new assets or the replacements of ones that are not currently scored within the state of good repair category because of a lack of data, either for in-service date or a state accepted standard for estimated service life for the items. And the major expansion program are those big construction projects that are worth over $3 million a piece. So this year, DRPT is recommending 56 projects within the SGR program to replace over 303 assets. Assets in this case is mostly vehicles, but we'll get to a little bit of a breakdown on that on the next slide. The 47 of the assets that were not recommended were either scored out or deemed ineligible. Scoring out would happen if they have not hit 80% of their useful life for age or mileage. And so every year we have a reduction in what is requested versus what we fund. In the minor enhancement program, we are funding 73 out of 129 projects that were applied for. Now, this was also due to, these were the ones that were not funded were deemed ineligible for the majority for reasons of lack of readiness or need, or having existing open grants that kind of satisfied those the funding needs for those projects. But it also included those projects that scored out. So every year we set a threshold limits for the projects in that category that will score. And in the major category, we are recommending 2 operating and rehab operating facility rehab and renovation projects for Suffolk and Dash, and we'll get into some details on those in a moment. Notably here, though, the funding that's outlined here, so the recommended $59 million for state of good repair, $20 million for minor enhancements, and $7.3 for major expansions, do not include the funding of the multi-year projects that were awarded in previous years. So you all may recall that last year we funded 2 major expansion projects, including the Shirlington facility in Hartford, and one other that is escaping me. Remembers, but those are the funding for those are not reflected there, even though they are being distributed through the city. Okay, so this is a breakdown here of the state of good repair program in our overall program. The funding threshold that we set this year was 51 points, and that was based on the kind of the money available and the pool of projects that were applied. There were 350 individual assets applied for and evaluated, and 303 that were selected for. As you see on the left here, the grand majority of this sub-program is dedicated to the replacement of revenue vehicles, followed by small amounts of money in the program going towards vehicle rehabilitations, support vehicles, and equipment for various different purposes, whether that's operating support, communications, facility improvements as well, and some maintenance equipment in there also. Generally, what happens within this sub area of the program, projects that score well are those revenue vehicle replacements and rehabilitations for vehicles that have hit the 80% kind of threshold on their useful lives, support vehicle replacements as well, and a small number of other projects that have both an in-service state and a state accepted service life that we can use to calculate the scores in this program. Projects that don't score well are those that have not hit 80% of their useful life. And that's generally the ones that fall to that bottom of the scoring list. Within the minor enhancement program, it's a little bit more complicated because there's more project types that end up being awarded every year. The scoring threshold over here on this side of the program is 25 points this year. And again, we received 129 applications in this category and funded 73 or recommended 73 for funding. To concentrate on the left side here, it's much more varied, as I mentioned. The largest percentage of the funding went to vehicle railcar rehabilitation this year at 30%. Followed by expansion vehicles, facility improvements for operating support at 16%, Equipment for operations support and system infrastructure, both around 11%, and customer facilities. And then just a lot of other categories that also receive funding, but they don't stand out as large here. And generally what happens here for projects that's to score well, the ones that often score well are the expansion vehicles, the rehab or replacements of vehicles or rail cars that we simply cannot score on the SGR side of things for lack of kind of data to score them. Equipment for operation support always scores well over here, as well as ITS systems, system infrastructure and maintenance equipment, as well as facility improvements that have operational impacts. The projects that consistently do not score as well are those for equipment for administrative support. So that often includes furniture and other things that agencies use around the office, and facility improvements that have non-operational impacts. On the major side of things, we are recommending 2 projects, as I mentioned, for funding. One is for the Alexandria Transit Company, or DASH. It is the renovation of their William B. Hurd Transit Facility. Now, this is a segment of a larger overhaul project that they are doing up there. The total cost of this segment is $9.3 million, and we funded it at 50%, so $4.6 million. City of Suffolk as well, we are recommending the replacement of their admin operations and maintenance facility, phase 2 of that project. That has a total cost of $5.2 million, that we are recommending 50% to be funded with state funds. Now, I'll note here that there were 4 applications that made it through the pre-application process, which we implemented a few years ago. But 2 of them were also eligible for the TRIP program and shifted over there, scored and funded that program. So there were a couple of other large construction projects that were also funded this year, not within the capital. And here we just break down a little bit about what that capital assistance and TRIP dual eligibility looks like. So if you all recall, in 2023, the General Assembly, they updated the legislation for the TRIP program that allowed additional categories to be eligible for funds in that program. And that significantly expanded the types of projects that now have dual eligibility between our capital program and our TRIP program. There's 4 areas within the TRIP program currently that includes regional connectivity, zero and reduced fares, public safety, and passenger amenities and facilities. The asterisk by 3 of those indicates that they could include capital purchases as well. So with that in mind, the chart on the right here illustrates what we would have funded as far as capital projects go with just the capital program versus with capital and TRIP put together. And so what this is saying is that we would have funded 131 projects for about $86 million through just the merit capital program. But because of that dual eligibility, we were able to provide funding to an additional 21 projects in the TRIP program, which would increase the total money going towards these capital projects to 114. And I'll pause. I've thrown a lot at you all. Do you all have any questions about the capital allocations this year?
Dr. Smith?
Where are the rail cars?
The rail cars for HRT?
Rail, what systems use rail cars?
Oh, okay.
That's a light rail project this year,
Yeah, so
Water enhancement, yeah. That's what HRT.
the main system that uses rail cars is VRE, and they are no longer eligible for either.
Right, that's what I thought, yeah.
The only system within the state that currently operates rail cars that are eligible within this program is HRT, their light rail system.
And so the Norfolk system, which has rail cars,
Yes, sir.
is that part of what you're talking about?
In the minor enhancement program, they applied for a project this year to overhaul and rehabilitate 8 rail cars over 6 years. And we funded that through the minor enhancement program.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions for Dan? Cindy?
Not sure if it's a question, observation, or just a comment, but the slide 11, I like that visualization. If you look at it just in itself, you're like, well, we didn't fund a lot. But then when you're breaking down they weren't eligible at 80%, so there were some that weren't quite ready yet. So it's an interesting story that it tells when you look at the different slides. I guess I was wondering if with more money, so therefore the scoring threshold might be higher on these three categories.
Sure.
Would there been more funded just on the threshold, or they still weren't at 80%? They still weren't complete. They still weren't ready. Like, what's the story that we're telling about these non-funded?
It's a mix of both. So the main activity that our staff do in the two months or so that we have to review the applications for any given fiscal year's funding is reviewing the eligibility, readiness, and need of projects. And this year, the majority of projects that weren't funded fell into that category of being ineligible, not ready, or as determined by DRPT, not needed right now. In addition to that, other projects did get filtered out based on their score falling too low compared to the threshold. And if we did have more money, those projects that just scored low could have been funded. So it's a combination of the two, and any given year it kind of goes back and forth between which one is the bigger category. This year, the larger amount was for eligibility, readiness, and need. Smaller amount was for scoring. In previous years, it was the opposite because more scored in, more made it through the eligibility reviews, but we simply didn't have enough money to fund it.
It's a pretty important story, and you don't necessarily pick it up if you just look at the individual slides. You got to kind of look at it. And the other part, Chair, if I may, I do appreciate seeing the TRIP information added here, because it's a very different story if you funded 4 capital projects or 4 that came in on major expansion, but you actually did a whole lot more when you looked at the 21 different. So I know it's separate, but I sometimes wonder why it's separate, because it really different categories and whatever and pots of money, but it's still serving our end game.
So I will say this is only the second year that we've had this dual eligibility. And so we as staff are still working out our storytelling around that, because they do fall, we fund them through different categories and they get kind of sorted out into those. But in reality, they're all capital projects that are being funded through state funding. And so we can work on our narrative surrounding that, kind of how we visualize that as well.
Is there a relationship between the number of applications for TRIP and this kind of movement of projects?
I'm sorry, I did not quite understand.
Are folks applying for the TRIP funding for capital?
So some people have applied directly to the TRIP program for capital, but often what we do is we flag capital applications for dual eligibility in the TRIP program, simply because we've had larger carryover balances and money available in the TRIP program. So we flag them in the capital program to send over to the TRIP program. And so we balance it kind of in the background between the two, but an applicant can apply for either one if they are eligible for that funding.
And are you mostly making the determination that they are eligible and pushing in that direction, or are they applying for both?
So generally speaking, we flag a number of them, push them over to TRIP. They are reviewed in the TRIP program for eligibility, and some of them come back to capital. So it's a bit of a back and forth.
And it's something we've had to, just to be fair, we've had to, we want to score them all the same. So we do score the TRIP projects that have gotten this in the same way, just to make sure they're not, people aren't able to get into TRIP and sort of get an advantage by not having to score the same as capital. Correct? I mean, we want to be fair about.
So yeah, all of the capital projects go through the same.
Exactly. Even
readiness reviews. TRIP and capital do have separate scoring.
Yeah, well, yeah, but yeah, we also, make sure that it's not something that you're able to short circuit the process by going through TRIP, if it's a capital project.
Mr. Chair. I think it's fair to say, and staff can correct me if I'm wrong, but I want to make sure everyone understands that the bottom line is we never penalize an applicant for applying in the wrong category. We have a policy where we have the discretion to look and make sure we put them where they can get the best outcome in terms of funding. We don't have the ability to increase the pot of funding. That's all the General Assembly. But we definitely want to make sure we're looking at an application carefully and putting it in the right bucket within our discretion so that we can fund the most projects possible.
Thanks. That's great clarification. Sure.
So on major expansion, there's no application that wasn't funded because of the TRIP. So in TRIP, were there some that weren't funded and was all the funding used, or is there something going into carryover again?
So within the TRIP program, there were a number of projects that did not score in or were deemed ineligible over there as well. But notably here, and the takeaway from this point at the bottom here was that there was 2 projects that would have scored into the capital program had we had enough money. However, we did not have enough revenues in the capital program, so we used our discretion to fund them through TRIP funding because they're eligible for it. And that includes a transfer center in the Hampton Roads area and a portion of the Fairfax County BRT project in Northern Virginia.
It would be helpful to know the projects if they were eligible for major, but you were able to shift them, so they got funded, but you don't know.
What I'm hearing here is that you all would like to see more information on what was shifted in.
At least this week does. I'll defer to the chair and other. Yeah, because some people didn't qualify, there's a balance in TRIP.
Right.
That
Well, it's
finished
just,
or no?
yeah, the program just, as soon as the program was passed, the pandemic hit, it was really meant for a lot of commuter service and that.
You used a lot of
obviously,
it
so that's
last year.
why it's been something that's evolved in a different environment from when it was adopted, I guess you might say. So it's been something we've been working on.
Yeah, and I don't know if we missed it. Can you speak at all to the TRIP recommended projects that are not capital projects? Because I think it handles other things as well, right?
It does, and yeah, here, so.
I might have missed that, so I apologize.
Within the public safety and passenger amenities categories, almost all of those projects that we fund are capital. There is eligibility for some planning and training around either of those as well. But the grand majority of those 2 categories are capital projects. The other ones, regional connectivity and zero and reduced fares. Zero and reduced fares, none of them are capital. It's entirely an operating.
Right, so are there recommended programs under those categories this year?
There are.
Yeah,
There are 2.
I just didn't see them, so.
No, and we're not presenting on the full picture of the TRIP program,
Okay.
which was maybe an oversight in this presentation. And so in that program, if I'm doing this off the top of my head, Tiffany, you can help me if I get it wrong. I believe there are 2 new projects in the zero and reduced fare category that we have selected for funding this year that are multi-year in nature, but we're also still paying for some of the previously approved projects that have multi-year obligations. In the regional connectivity category, I'm not sure if we funded any that were not capital in character, that were more operating in character this year. I think there were some, but I don't know them off the top of my head.
Just one more comment. TRIP doesn't fall under TSDAC in our scope, but in order to look at any impacts on merit and capital, I feel like we need to see the whole picture. So I appreciate part of this, and I hope that DRPT staff can round us out a little bit, because for me, I can't totally bifurcate it when I'm looking at that.
Certainly, yeah. And in a future meeting, we can bring that back to you. But also, I will direct you all to last month's CTV meeting, where we summarize all of our different program areas, and you can see the number of projects and the funding going towards these 4 different categories. And again, we apologize for not including it today.
Do that. What I love, though, is you've connected the dots here between capital, especially major capital.
Ms. Jackson?
I was just going to say, I think Cindy's point about listing or providing more information regarding the TRIP, the dual eligibility for transit agencies so that they know what they could have applied for. I know those transit agencies that received it know that they got a TRIP grant, but it may be beneficial for them for us as a body to know which projects actually made the cut so that we can apply for those in the future where we may never have applied at all.
Okay. Anything else on this item? So now we're going to go on.
Move on to the next 2 subsections here. And so we often do this later in the season, but we prepared to look into this now. We look at the operating and capital assistance programs and give an overall summary of what those programs are looking at and projections of future funding versus what we see as needs coming up over the next few years. And so starting with the operating assistance program, we went over a little bit of this back in October of last year, but I want to kind of rehash it and to update it a little bit. So here, this slide just presents an overall summary of what we're looking at in the program. And at the bottom, we get into a little bit about what we're looking at starting in FY27, which is next year and beyond. So as you all know, over the past 4 fiscal years, our operating revenues have exceeded projected values by quite a bit due to what we call one-time revenues that were put into the program. Some of it was pandemic era funding that came from the CTB. Others were project de-obligations that came into the capital program that we have the discretion to shift over to operating in times of need. And so this resulted in historically high revenues in FYs 23 and 22, and significantly higher than normal revenues in FY 24. In FY 25, just to remind you all, last year, we were also able to provide levels of funding that were higher than what we received from the General Assembly due to those project de-obligations that we shifted into the program. In FY 26, however, as you all just saw, most agencies are experiencing a decrease compared to FY 25 for a combination of a number of different reasons. So again, lower overall revenues in the program is part of that. Sizing and performance metrics for each agency is, of course, another part of it. But then the rising operational costs for all agencies also impacts that, because those that do well in the formula can capture more of the money, and there's less to distribute to those that don't do that as well. Okay. Projection moving forward is that in FY 27 and beyond, operating costs are still projected to rise more than projected revenues. So our kind of conservative takeaway here is that agencies that experienced a decrease between FY 25 and 26 will likely experience a decrease next year unless our projections are far under what they will ultimately be. Okay, and I'll pause there. I see some questions.
To help us sort of ground us, especially for those who may be also paying attention to the dynamics that perhaps VDOT has, can you talk about, is it code or is it CTB policy that does the allocation of how much money should go for operating versus capital?
Code.
Okay, so that is not, so again, like what may happen with our colleagues over at VDOT, if there's a shortage in maintenance, they are able to move things over. Right now in code, there's a set percentage, yes? That's for operating.
We are able to shift. There's something in code that says in times of state economic need or some language like that, we can shift money from capital or the special program to operating assistance. And yeah, so it's kind of like, again, statewide economic need or distress is not always defined. I mean, so yeah, but there's a little bit of wiggle room there for us, but it is code certainly that says those.
I think that's very helpful. I think the other thing, and I just heard, we had our Northern Virginia District CTB hearing just last week, and I heard the secretary speak, and actually it was the same talking point that I brought in my comments, which is the disconnect in the growth of the Commonwealth Transportation Fund compared to the cost of transportation. It's a disconnect of about 6% between inflation, basically, and the revenues that are coming in. So I know we're just talking TSDAC, we're just talking DRPT, but I think it's probably helpful for us all to be thinking about what is the economic health and revenue of the revenues going into the Commonwealth Transportation Fund, because that has already been a disconnect in the growth of those funds compared to the costs of actually just doing stuff in the transportation sector. And I will, of course, continue to say, in transit's not alone, highways, it's the same place. VDOT has the opportunity to shift money over easier. It is wonderful to hear that you guys can do that. But I think, as we as a group sort of collectively think about, especially if there are legislative changes that may come up, is sort of the health of the Commonwealth Transportation Fund at overall is already disconnected. And so the fact that DRPT, you guys are seeing that concentrated, not meeting the needs as you have with those last two bullets, I think is really helpful for us to be aware of. And again, I've heard the secretary speak the same thing of the highway program. So I'll get off my soapbox.
Thanks.
The questions before I move on?
Just one point. That might, is that something you've raised at all with the Boulevard Committee at all? Because quite frankly, there's a bigger problem. Look at the impact of what the federal government is doing, capital. And so we might want to make sure that gets on the radar screen for them as well.
Happy to do that. Obviously, it's on the radar screen for SJ28 Transit Funding Subcommittee. But maybe you and I can talk offline about how we can make sure it's getting to the right places.
Anything else before Dan moves on?
Great. All right, on to the next slide then. So this will likely look familiar to you all. I believe I presented a very similar slide in October of last year. I know there's a lot going on here. This is made so it can kind of stand on its own, so you can look at what all of these different inputs are, but I'll just give you the overall gist here. First of all, I'll explain what we're looking at in terms of colors and future years. So this is showing the overall operating assistance revenues between FY19 and FY31. So 19 to 26 are actual values, 27 to 31 are projected values. And that's attempted to be illustrated here through the striping, but it always looks different on a computer screen and a big screen where you're presenting. So FY27 and beyond are projections of the future. What you're looking at for the historic data of FY19 through 26 is the dark blue bars are the new funds coming into the program from the CMTF, and the lighter blue are the one-time revenues that came into the program. And so I'm just going to skip forward to FY22 because that's kind of like we're still on that downward slope from those pandemic era highs. In FY22 and 23, there was large amounts of either uplift funding that was provided to us in the middle of the year or CTV discretionary funds made available to DRPT for transit operating in those 2 years. It kept the program floated at around $165 million a year, which allowed us to provide 30% maximum operating assistance allocations to all of our agencies. We are still coming down from that. So in FY24, we took a step down to $133 million, but notably there was still $11 million of carryover in the program from those pandemic high years. Last year, we were supposed to have around $114 million, but because we shifted more money into the program, we had $128 million. This year, we're at about $127 million. This also illustrates carryovers and those little balances that we keep at the end of the year that move into the program for the next year. But essentially, we're kind of flattening out here. Moving forward, all we're including here is the projected revenues coming in from the CMTF, which is new funds, because we don't know what these carryover balances might be still. So we had 127 million last year. Right now, our best guess is we're going to have 122 million next year. Will likely be a little bit more than that, but that's what we're looking at. And so comparing that kind of picture to the overall needs. Now we put together a bit of a rudimentary projection, getting at Kate's point a little bit, looking at costs versus revenues in the program. Again, here I'll just explain what we're looking at because some of the striping on here is not as clear as I would like it to be. So this is looking at FY19 to 31 as well. New funding in dark blue from the CMTF within the operating program, and in the blue-green color, it is operating costs, eligible operating costs used in the formula in each of those fiscal years. Through FY26 is actual values. After FY27 and beyond are projected values. And so here what we're showing is that that you can follow along on the left, but essentially FY27 through 31, the growth in projected costs is projected to outpace the growth in projected revenues. And to do this, we don't have sophisticated methods for using econometric models to assume projections of 38 separate agencies. And so we look at average growth over the past few years. And so that 7% growth in costs is based on an average of the last 5 years. Whereas the growth in revenues is based on the projections that we get from VDOT and included in our 6-year. So essentially, we're looking at about next year, no growth in the program, but after that, about a 3% growth year over year in the program, compared to about a 7% growth in costs over across the state. And so that's what frames that bullet point on cost outpacing revenues. Questions on this? Okay. So similarly, in the capital assistance program, I wanted to give you all a break in that program. So as an overall summary, over the past 7 fiscal years, it's a lot of fiscal years, the capital assistance revenues exceeded projected levels due to, again, one-time revenues. Prior to the pandemic, that was big carryover balances that we were able to carry in the system or in the program, or deobligated values that actually came back into DRPT from WMATA when they were taken out in FY17 and various other project deobligations over the years. And so some of that, as I mentioned, was pandemic era funding as well that came in through some uplift funding that we got from CTP throughout those fiscal years. In FY26, we do have more in revenues to distribute than we projected due to project deobligations over the past year that came back into our projection here, though, is that increases in cost of capital purchases across the board, industry-wide, are putting pressures on that program. So even though our revenues have stayed pretty stable, we can't buy as much with those revenues as we used to be able to. In FY27, the capital needs are projected to increase and revenues are projected to stay flat, similar to the operating side of things. In addition, there's a note on here that there's changes in the rural transit program that may put additional pressures on our capital program, namely because our federal dollars over there, due to these cost increases, are not going as far as they did before. And so we've changed some match rates around and are giving more state funding to rural capital projects than we had in the past. We used to do 80% federal, 16% state. Now we are doing 28% federal and 68% state. So that puts additional pressures on the capital. So similar to the operating, I'm created some graphs here that show revenues over time. The dark blue bars here are the new funds coming from the CMTF. The light blue bars are those one-time revenues. And you can see in those early years, we had more one-time revenues than we had new revenues coming. Those days are gone, and now coming out of the pandemic in FY24, our new revenues are at a higher level due to the omnibus bill and the provisions of that bill that passed, and our carryover revenues are. And so here, the main takeaway is that, again here, through FY26 is historic, beyond FY26 is projected. The main takeaway here is that in FY26, we had about $96 million available for all capital projects. In FY27, we're projecting that we'll have about 89 available. So, and then even a step down beyond that for future projections. And the reason for that is that we can't project project deobligations throughout the year. And likely what will happen is the FY27 value and others will be slightly higher, but our projections do not show that. As of today. And so really, this is the important takeaway here. So we using our 5-year capital budgets that transit agencies submit on an annual basis, we project out needs versus projected revenues. And so this chart is the most complicated one here. So I'll break down the elements that we're looking at first before I get into some of the conclusions of it. So here, FY20 through 26 these are observed actual values. What we're looking at here in the blue bars are the revenues in the program, and the green dots, the lines connecting it, are the allocations that we made in each of those years in the capital program. For FY27 to 30, and notably we don't have 31 in here yet because we are currently doing our 5-year budget updates now. So we only have what we had last year. For FY27 through 30, we're looking at projections. And so the blue striped bars are projected revenues, and the green dots are projected needs based on maximum match rates at the state level. Gray areas are illustrating the gap between the needs and the revenues. And so what we're projecting here with the next 4 fiscal years is a $231 million funding gap between what agencies are expressing as their need for what they're eligible for and the funding that we will have to fund it. And to further illustrate that, I've also put a line on here on FY26 to show the FY26 funding request. So this is the expressed need of our agencies. They came in for $145 million of capital funding. We funded $93 million, but 86 in new. 93 includes the previous multi-year allocations as well. So that gap shows what what we could not fund for lack of funding, or those projects that we deemed ineligible, not ready, or not needed at this point in time. And so what this is showing is moving forward, our agencies are expressing much higher needs than our revenues will be able to provide for. And I'll pause there. I know this one's complicated. This is also the presentation. So if you all have any questions on these projections, I'm happy to get into it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to confirm, the numbers you're getting from our local transit systems are through their strategic plans? Or how do you do the data collection? Because I know they do those periodically, right? So you want to talk a little bit about that
Every year
relationship?
it's a separate process. So generally it's guided by their strategic planning process or the transit development plans. But every year we request them to fill out the forms that will indicate what their planned new requests for funds look like over the next 5 fiscal years. Okay, so they're updated annually. We also do a review to ground check, to kind of ground truth it, make sure that the requests are aligned with what we know are realistic timeframes. We often reduce what is included in those to be more realistic.
You're right. It should be coming out of that process, strategic.
Right, right. I guess what I was getting at is that, so, obviously there's a lot of economic changes, and there's also, I know there's a huge wave of systems doing their plans. And so there's going to be another wave of, updates and things like that, that change things up. I also know up in the Northern Virginia, there's a lot of focus, especially as we work through some of the DMV moves and SJ28 things, to sort of go back and revisit, obviously ensuring that the state's a participant, but it's also helpful for us to understand our local needs. So just knowing that these are going to be constantly changing. And also, it's like Mr. Dyke was saying, that as we look at the economic conditions of the state, reflecting what's happening, sort of the national economy, sort of see how those things change out.
And so they do have the opportunity to update it on an annual basis to that point. But for example, what we can see here, and we're not illustrating this on this slide, last year, the projection for FY26 was that the agencies would need $120 million in state funds. What we saw was $145 million worth of requests, and that is not including the requests that were shifted over to the TRIP program. And so the actual requests 1 year out, the projections were far lower than the actual requests the next year. And so these actual needs they could be higher or lower, but generally they're higher than what the agencies tell us even 1 year out.
Right. And I was going to say another dynamic that at play, there may have been some of our transit systems that were looking to some of the discretionary programs of U.S. Department of Transportation. There's only a small number that are not subject to getting hit by budget cuts. So the low-no program and other things like that are very risky. And I could see that shifting to then potentially looking at capital programs.
Certainly. And we had one project in here this year. Fairfax County received a low-no grants for something like $60 million to fund a number of hybrid vehicles. And we did the math on that. If they had come in requesting their state match on those, it would have cost us an extra $38 million in the state. And so that was offset by that discretionary program that they received last year, or that discretionary program funding rather. And so, yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty in this, but the takeaway of all of this, I know this is very technical, there's a lot of fancy charts and graphs here, but it's that rising costs across the industry are putting pressure on our programs, which the revenues are just simply not climbing as fast as the costs are climbing.
Yes, Dr. Toon.
So what do you see as the implication of that, being able to provide services out of those areas where we have the significant funding gap?
So the implication of not having enough state funds to fund the capital or operating needs are that localities will either need to find more money locally, or they'll need to cut back on their services. Without additional federal or state dollars coming into the program, it's on the locals to kind of figure out their funding gaps.
Right. Yeah, and to that point, that's one thing I've been looking at, going back to slide 19 with the growth and operating costs, new revenues. From a small agency perspective, that rely heavily on state and federal sources and don't have the ability to necessarily make up those local fundings. we're sort of putting, well, we aren't, but this economic trend is putting them sort of in a death spiral, because if they cut back on service, their costs are going to be reduced. Also going to cut back on performance. So in future years, they're going to be getting less state funding as well. So it's sort of trifold, especially for those smaller agencies that can't make up the difference.
An interesting example of that is your former agency, GLTC, who in 2020 or 2021 lost service to the Liberty campus.
Yep.
And so what happened there was that was a large percentage of their budget. It was also a significant percentage of their total costs, hours and miles. So it reduced their sizing metrics, which led to multiple years of lower state allocations. And now they're coming out of it.
Yeah, and they also got hit on the federal side too, because they lost the small transit intensive cities, the STIC performance funding on the federal side. Believe me, I was well aware of where we were headed while I was still there.
It's cheery.
Eggs in that basket.
Yes.
Chair. I like storytelling and the
Yes.
narrative. So all the other slides were good too, but I do think slide 19, as Brian was mentioning, and 23 are really important things that we need to be focused on. Kate's earlier point about expenses are here and revenue are here. It just visualizes that story. Projections are always projections, but we need to have them and work.
Yeah, I had a back and forth with staff, but there's like 7%'s a little high, but the fact is it really doesn't matter. The costs are going to be outpacing the revenues by a good amount, regardless whether you use 7% or 4% or 5%. So.
And we don't know the federal impact fully yet.
Other questions or comments? Hearing none. Hearing now down to the number 7, Merit Capital and the Operating Assistance Program Review.
Just the directive you want
Sure.
to start this one.
Thank you. I knew we had a slide. We promised in the last meeting that this meeting today was going to be primarily to go over the SIP allocations for this year and have a discussion there. But we wanted to also provide an update as to how things are going with our review of the merit program. We have had a kickoff meeting with our consultant, Kimberly Horn, and it went really well. There is a lot to look at. And I think all of you know this program probably better than I do. So it was a really long, in-depth meeting, and our team, our staff spent several hours working back and forth and talking through kind of the issues and concerns that have come up over the last year or two in the allocations and prioritizations in operating, and then separately in capital. And we talked about some of those last year. We're looking at, did we put this on the side? Under the operating, go back, please. Thank you. Under the operating assistance, we talked about this a little bit, I think, in our last meeting, but we are looking at examples like Petersburg in this SIP allocation, where agencies may actually lose funding when they turn out to operate in a more cost-efficient way. Petersburg spent less, kept service stable, but they lost money because of the high weight on the amount you spend. So the consultant is going to be looking at potentially adjusting the size weight formula and running a lot of scenarios so that we can come back and show you what that would look like. They're going to be looking at performance metrics. We also talked about whether or not it makes sense to compare performance metrics of each agency to the statewide trend. We have some agencies who are high performers every single year, and they're not being credited for that when compared to the state trend, and the state trend might be going up, and they were up all along, and they kind of didn't get the credit for that. So, those two things alone, it's obvious. I think anyone in any room would say we certainly don't want to disincentivize cost efficiency. We don't want to disincentivize high performance year over year. So the consultant, I don't have all the answers, but the consultant is looking at those things and kind of doing a deeper dive so they can come back to us with some potential recommendations that we will then bring back to you. They're also looking very closely at the funding, at a potential, at minimizing the need for the iteration up to 30%. We have found, especially over the last couple of years when we had more money, but even now when we don't have the COVID money, if we have enough money where once the first allocation goes through, it's really complex and hard to explain how we do the second iteration. And if one agency got more or less money based on their performance metrics overlay, that might be completely canceled out when we do the second iteration up to 30%. I think their funding is backfilled anyway. So my staff probably explains this more clearly than I do, but these are kind of the layman's terms that I have understood to see kind of the gaps or the areas of concern that maybe we could do a little better. Again, I think we talked in the last meeting, this methodology in the merit program is really complex. It's been tough for our staff and myself to kind of explain to our agencies. We've met with agencies and they don't necessarily understand how they got to their funding amount. You guys probably understand that better than most. But we've asked the consultant to just look at overarching themes to improve and tweaks that they could potentially recommend to make things more fair and to incentivize efficiency, but also to potentially simplify, if that's possible. We're looking at all of the above. In the capital program, we are looking to see if new subcategories for state of good repair and our other categories would make sense, so that we aren't constantly kind of not funding certain projects that just don't get the look because they don't score. Maybe it would be better to have really clear subcategories so agencies know exactly what they're applying for and have a better idea of what will be funded and won't be funded. We don't want to waste staff time and we don't want to waste your time either in putting in these complex allocations. We're looking at the list of incentives and whether or not the point structure there. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe with each of the incentives in the categories, we give like a 0 points or 5 points if you reach one of those incentive categories. Can someone list the categories for me?
Zero emissions vehicles is one of the categories. Technology and innovation is another, and that's things like mobile ticketing and real-time arrival information. The third is passenger amenities. And the fourth is what we call agency accountability. So that's a number of different checks that we do throughout the year to make sure that agencies are complying with requirements. And if they comply with all of them, they get 5 extra points on all of their categories. That's more of a carrot.
Yes, thank you. So, and the question is, does 5 points really help them enough in those categories? Should there be a higher score value and a range where they could get partial points? Those are some of the things we're looking at. Do the categories still make sense? We're kind of looking at historical data of who has gotten those points over the years, and are we actually awarding them or are we not? So that's one category of area we're looking at. We're looking at all the default values of our service impact scoring. I think that's a summary. Am I missing anything from kind of how our lengthy meeting with the consultant went? And again, as we told you, we're going to bring back recommendations once they have those ready within the next month or two, that we can talk through as well. But we think this program is, now that the COVID funding is no longer, and the way that the forecasts are looking with costs rising and our funding not rising, we think that anything we can do to find some ways to tweak this program and make our money go further will be helpful for all of you. And we're just grateful for the opportunity to be looking at it and coming back to you to help us figure this out.
Well, thank you very much, Director Ramsden, for that insight into what's going to happen. I think Cindy and I can still remember where the blood stains are. Original development of this program, but we're in a period where there's a lot in flux, and it's going to be really important to figure out how to address the needs of what I think is an increasingly transit interested and dependent population with more robust service at the same time that we're unsure of where the money to support that's going to come from. So thanks for laying that out for us and giving us something to look forward to.
We have a question. We've got some, I know there's the Virginia Transit Association has their conference coming up. I'm assuming CTAB does as well. And most of our transit systems are probably part of that. Is there opportunities for maybe listening sessions or some other stakeholder engagement to hear sort of what's been working and what hasn't from the perspective of those transit systems? I don't know how
Yeah,
you
I
guys,
think,
or should they just work for
yeah.
us and that's fine. I just want to understand how.
No, those are opportunities. We've been talking, internally, and even the governor's office had just rolled out stuff about having goals and stuff for us. And certainly one of our goals is to make other opportunities to have listening time with agencies, whether it be kind of informal or something. So even DRPT, VTA, and CTAF, we're going to try to talk amongst everybody just to get some of these more informal things where you, like you say, you can bring up stuff. And I think agencies always want an opportunity to coordinate, collaborate more. So we're certainly going to work on that with VTA.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I mean, the opportunities for sort of what's working, what isn't, may not be obvious. Or honestly, it could be that some of the systems have not mentioned those to DRPT, but to have that sort of safe space to share that can be helpful. I too, as I say, I think I've been involved in this process since the merit existed or was sort of founded. So it's nice to see that it's actually, I think, done some really remarkable things, but hearing from the folks, to make sure that we're not missing some blind spots of opportunities to make it easier and more transparent, which I think is what you're trying to get at.
That's exactly right. And that's a great idea. As Zach mentioned, we at DRPT are in the process of putting together an entire plan to have more stakeholder engagement as a department. So this fits right in. And we're happy to be kind of talking about this every time we're doing that in the coming weeks and months so that we can kind of accumulate and jot down all of that feedback and then share it with all of you in the next meetings.
Like you said, VTA and CTAB are sort of broken up. Some of the larger agencies, some of the small agencies, some of that's coming together, but again, we're all involved in this. And so getting it to where we can all collaborate and talk, certainly want to move towards that as well.
So we're looking to a meeting and sometime in the summer.
You speaking about TSDAC?
Yes.
I assume so. I'm not sure what some of it'll be at.
Yes, we're having a kind of a bi-weekly meetings with the consultant. And as soon as they can, get some draft recommendations in place for us to go over, we will schedule a meeting with you.
I was pleased to hear the word scenarios because that really helps us see the
Absolutely.
barbells and
Take it out of the
upset
abstract.
the apple cart or not upset the apple cart.
Sure. We're aiming for June, July. It's a little bit dependent on the consultant's work.
Yeah, and to follow up a little bit on your comment about these upcoming conferences, it might be good to share with the members of TSDAC some updates on when those are being held, and maybe to the extent some of us could sit in on that, it would be helpful to hear first.
Well, I know I can speak to the Virginia Transit Association, which is actually going to be here in Richmond. And it's the Wednesday and Thursday after Memorial Day.
Okay.
I know I could probably look up the dates, but I've got my eyes on the
28th.
28th and 29th, and that's here. And I know a number of us are involved in panels and other things like that. So there's definitely, and there's also the board meeting that starts off on that Wednesday. So this, I know already, just talking to Danny Plower, who's organizing the VTA, will be a topic of conversation at the board meeting, just to kick things off. Never mind, probably just sort of the talk around the room.
Yeah, I think that would be good, and for us actually to get the word out to them that, hey, we're going to have some folks there from DRPT and TSDAC, just to hear what you have to say, so that they realize that this is an open process to get that collaboration you're talking about.
And CTAB's is their conference is in August, the 19th through the 21st. And it's in Roanoke, and the agenda is still coming together on that one.
We can certainly share the dates for both conferences coming up with this group as a follow-up, just so everyone can put it on their calendar.
Well, I think that concludes the staff presentations and moves us on to the public hearing. TSDAC. So with that, unless there's anything before we go into the public hearing, let me go ahead and open the public hearing. Is there anybody?
Doesn't appear to be any in person. Is there anybody online?
It's quiet at the moment.
I thought there was somebody that raised their hand to do it.
It was earlier.
Somebody wanted to like speak during y'all's discussion and presentation. We said, no, that's not.
Maybe we answered all the questions and concerns.
Right, that's a good thing.
Maybe they got caught in the rain that I did coming down.
So if not,
Nobody was online.
going once, going twice. Close the public hearing. Okay. Next item on the agenda is open discussion. If there's anything we haven't had a chance to talk about now, if anything you'd like to bring up, Cindy.
I would just like to request consideration, even though the state code requires us to at least meet annually and hold a public hearing, that we actually hold a public hearing when we have recommendations and issues back out for everybody. And
I think there's no question that'll be an important part of the
official
the
ask.
process. Yeah.
We're just meeting the minimum today. So that would be breaking the law today, so.
Yeah, so we are compliant, but to the collaboration and the stakeholder input, Zach, I appreciate that.
Okay, that brings us to wrap up and next steps.
I mean, yeah, we had said we'll try to get another meeting together as this evolves, and so that'll be certainly be timely notification of those. And
Definitely appreciate that as we get into summer and things like
Yeah.
that, give us lots of heads up when those may be an options, especially if it's the ability to be doing it remote. It is lovely to see all of you in person. However, our ability to participate may be limited by that when it comes to summertime. So,
Agree. We totally plan to offer a remote option. And we will I would like to say that within the coming month, within the next 4 weeks, we will be offering kind of dates and options. We'll be giving an outlook and doing a poll so that we can find out what the best availability is, understanding that everyone plans vacation in the summer and it might be easier said than done.
If I could ask, especially since we have so many people online and we've got 2 conferences coming up, remind me of the timeline and all of us for when a recommendation would need to be made to go to the CTB for the next application process, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure, I can give a quick summary of that. My dates might be a little bit off since I'm doing it off the top of my head, but essentially our goal, if with talking to the consultant, seems to be that they believe after having an initial long discussion and spending some weeks working on this and having these bi-weekly calls with our staff, they believe they can bring some draft recommendations to us late June or July, at which time we will meet with you. And at some point in time after that, we are required to have a 45-day public comment on any approved recommendations for changes to the program. So we would get through that process. We would love to bring, if we have recommendations that are approved and go through the public comment process, we would love to bring that to the CTB by their October meeting because they don't meet in November. There is a December meeting and there is a likelihood of a potential January meeting. So that kind of is the timeline from here until the end of this administration. And the consultant seemed to be on board with kind of looking at this. We are not developing the program. We're looking at lessons learned over the last few years and potentially since we've, had the elimination of the additional money from the COVID pandemic. And what that means for how this methodology works and plays out. So they think that after working with our staff, some of the areas of concern, they think they have some solid pathways forward to present some recommendations. Some of the areas are really complex and we may not be able to reach consensus on, you know, a way forward that is simpler and plays out in the scenarios without, you know, causing more confusion. So we'll have to see where we end up, but it's kind of a calendar year 2025 process, we hope.
To clarify, it would not be in place until applications a full year later.
That is exactly right.
To say that for the public, that this is
Yes.
not next year's DRBT applications, it would be a full year.
It would be to be implemented in FY '28. Something else I forgot to mention, we did also talk about, to back up, the reason for that obviously is even for our own staff, we're doing workshops prior to the application round. Our application round opens early December. Applications are due in February. There's no way we would want to throw that on our applicants at the last minute. We need a full year to educate and make sure everyone understands what has changed and to change our applications and do the right workshops. Also, we talked to the consultant. Part of their recommendations that they bring back might be a phased-in approach, a hold harmless, a period of time, depending on if weights shift, maybe they would shift in stages over a couple or 3 years. I'm kind of speaking freely about how our conversations went. We'll see what they bring back, and what they bring back in terms of draft recommendations might be options for us to look at as well. So we can think about that at our next meeting.
Yeah, can I just mention a couple of things? One is figuring out this timetable. We also need to consider that we're probably going to have, and this goes back to the point about the federal impact and how that's going to work out. It's probably going to be a General Assembly special session in September. And some, to the extent we have some information that might be useful prior to that, even if it's just preliminary, it'd be good to share with that and make sure that that's part of the mix, because we want to make sure they're not doing anything at that point that will impact our ability. And then the other reality is after November 5th, we need to be prepared to sit down with whichever administration is coming in to share this information with them, because I know they're really thinking about that and trying to plan ahead, because literally you have to hit the ground running. And to the extent we can brief them as soon as possible, I think that's going to be to our advantage to make sure that we're on the radar screen. And it wouldn't help to have some discussions in the interim. I think some of them may be doing that. So to the extent we have information, that would be helpful.
Couldn't agree with you more. Thank you.
Great. Anything else? Anybody want to, Jamie, did you have anything you want to add? Nicole? Smooth. Anything else?
I'm good. Thanks for this conversation.
Brian?
Let's make sure it's not raining on the way back.
Here, many of us have long rides back.
Oh, yes.
We also have lunch for you. So that was to be delivered at 11:30.
Yeah, it's here. And so.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
So perfect timing.
Anything you want to say again?
No, thank you all for coming in person. I realize everybody traveled a long way. Some of you a really long way in the rain. But it's really nice to get together in person. It makes it a little bit easier to then do follow-ups virtual. And especially for me, many of you I've been in many meetings with, but some I'm just getting to meet for the first time. So thank you.
So with that, I'll adjourn this meeting.
Wonderful. Thank you.